What is up, guys? It's Karsten Craning back at it again with another YouTube video. I just wanted to start this one off with thanking you guys for 20,000 subscribers. It's only been a year since we've hit 10,000 subscribers. To get to 20,000 is insane. I'm really happy about that, and I want to thank each and every one of you for your support, because without you, I couldn't be making this content, and all your support means so much to me. So thank you guys for 20,000. It means a lot. Today is a little bit different. We're not necessarily talking about the realm of clothes, more about furniture and this little DIY project that I wanted to share with you guys. In particular, today we're talking about the Owens Stag stool. This is a piece of furniture that's meant a lot to me. I actually studied classical art and architecture, but my interest in contemporary architecture and furniture didn't really blossom until I became interested in Owens clothing. And from there, I got into contemporary furniture more because of his furniture itself. Owens' clothes takes a lot of cues from both Brutalist and Bauhaus designs, and also his furniture takes very heavily from those design principles. What really interested me about his furniture at first is because he uses that Brutalist Bauhaus design, but he brings in elements of the natural world. He uses materials such as fur, antler, etc., etc. And to me, that was very interesting, coming from Minnesota, where you often see fur or antler used in kind of more rustic decoration, to translate those materials into a more brutalist setting was something that really fascinated me. And one of the first pieces of furniture that I really became interested or enthralled with was the Stag stool itself. If you're interested in learning more about contemporary furniture or architecture, I would recommend a few things. First, Enigma Curation. He also does a lot of TikToks on certain pieces of furniture that he finds interesting. So if you're looking for some inspiration there, I would definitely go check those out. And also the Owens connection to furniture is, of course, very important. You can actually go get a whole book on Owens furniture. I believe it's on Amazon for somewhere between $40 to $70. So if you're really interested in Owens furniture and want to find out more about that, I would definitely go check that out. Anyways, back to the Stag stool. I initially found out about the Stag stool when I was getting into Owens in around 2016, and it was the first piece of furniture that I came across and was like, wow, this is amazing. Something that shut me off completely though was the price tag. Oftentimes these resale for $5,000 to $7,500, which is completely out of my price range. The other thing is that oftentimes, I'm not sure how much it retails for, but it is very expensive. And I'm not someone who is in the position to pay thousands upon thousands of dollars for a piece of furniture. Owens furniture can often get in the tens of thousands of dollars. Also, just because Owens furniture is so expensive, don't be discouraged if you still want to get into interior design or architecture. There are a lot of other interesting designers who you can access their furniture for a much lower price point than Rick. For example, Marcel Brewer. I'm sure many of you are more familiar with the Wasili chair, which has been kind of hyped recently. You can find those for around the $400 to $600 price point. Still very expensive for a piece of furniture, but the entry level into furniture is not always as high as Rick. Now this spring I went and visited the Owens store in Miami, and one of the pieces that I actually got to see was the Stag stool itself, and I immediately realized that I could create this on my own. The Stag stools in person actually are a lot smaller and tend to be a lot smaller than they look in a photo. They're usually around 17 inches tall and 13 inches wide. That's pretty small. It's like the size of your torso. It's kind of like this big, if that helps. So definitely for me, not worth the $5,000 to $7,500 price tag, but I figured I could make it myself and it would be a fun DIY project. And I was actually able to make it for only $200. So if you're interested in doing this, you can make it for around $200 to $250. Really the deciding factor in making this project is going to be how much you want to spend on an antler, but we'll get into that later. I guess there's also a conversation to be had about if making DIY furniture is reps or if it's hurtful to the designer. For me, I think it's just a fun DIY project. I'm not claiming this design as my own. I'm not making a whole bunch of these and selling them and profiting off of his design. And I'd like to imagine Owens would be empathetic or even somewhat touched that a college student who doesn't have as much excess cash would go out of their way to recreate furniture. Also, if you really think Rick is making his bag off Stag stools, nah, it's definitely Ramones to Playboy Cardi fans, guys, let's be real. So let's get into the materials you're gonna need. First, you're gonna need an antler, preferably a moose antler. The second thing you're gonna need is wood, and then a paint or a poly/stain to actually paint the wood or get it the desired color, and then 3 screws. As far as the antler goes, I would recommend using a moose antler because they have the most girth to them. Oftentimes you'll look at stag stools. A stag is actually a deer, but a moose antler is often used, which is kind of weird. But the reason a moose antler is used is because it has the most girth or mass to it, which allows for the L shape of the wood to be supported easily. You can use another antler if you want, but I would highly recommend using a moose antler just because that's going to make the most sturdy product. One more thing to note about the antler: if you're vegan, for example, or if you just don't like the idea of killing a moose for your own furniture, something to note about moose in particular is that they shed their antlers, I think, once a year or once every couple of years, and people will go out into the woods and find these antlers and usually sell them on eBay. So if you don't want to participate in actually killing a moose to get your antler, there are a lot of people on eBay who are selling these moose antlers. Usually they're selling them to actually get turned into dog chews. So it's actually more sustainable to turn them into furniture. So you can go on eBay, you can look, and you can find a bunch of these that have been shed instead of shot, and they're usually cheaper. They may not be in as good condition as one that's been shot for a mount, but you can usually find a singular one, which will be important for this project, instead of a double set, for cheaper, and also it's more ethical for people who care about that. The second thing you're going to need, of course, is the wood. I would recommend a high quality wood for furniture. I used a really thick, beautiful Doug fir for mine, but you can use a lot of different woods, and that can change depending on your price range. And then either a paint or a poly/stain. A paint, you can use paint if you want, or you can use a stain. I went with a stain. That is also going to be dependent on whatever wood you want to use, because paints and stains are going to apply differently to the type of wood you use. You're also going to need a variety of tools. First of all, you're going to need a drill of some sort to drill in the screws to the actual material. Second thing is you're going to need a pretty strong or powerful saw of some sort. So I would personally recommend using a skill saw or a table saw of some sort, just so you can get those clean cuts. And then the other thing you're going to need is brushes for your paint or poly. If you are in a more urban area and you don't have access to a space or these tools, something I would check out is there's often community workshops where you have oftentimes studios of woodworkers who share tools. Now let's get into it. I want to give everybody a warning on this first step. You don't necessarily need to do this. I would only recommend doing this if you have access to another tool called a planer. Generally, having a planer on hand is not something that you're going to be able to do unless you have access to a wood shop. But if you do have access to a wood shop in some way, shape, or form, using a planer is a great idea. The reason you need a planer for this step is because for my wood, I pretty much went and DIY'd the actual planks in order to prevent something called cupping. You can just skip this part if you just want to go to the store and have your wood cut to the dimensions you want. So for this first part, what I'm doing is I'm taking a bunch of 2x4s and gluing them together with wood glue. The reason I'm taking 2x4s instead of cutting a giant piece of wood or just using a giant piece of wood is because I'm trying to prevent something called cupping. Cupping is where the wood will warp because of the grain, and so to prevent that, what I'm doing is I'm taking the 2x4s, flipping and inversing them to each having a different side of the grain, and this way the cupping will be prevented and the wood won't warp over time. Again, I'm just gluing them together with some wood glue and letting them sit for around 24 hours. And then I'm putting them in the planer, which is going to smooth them out, make the wood consistent, and pretty much take all these small pieces of wood and make them into one giant plank. Something that's going to be really important about this project is you do not want to cut the pieces of wood down to size right away. This is something where you do need to be creative and kind of eyeball how much wood you're going to need as the project goes along. Next step, welcome back if you skipped the previous one. You're going to want to take the wood you either bought and got cut or that you used the planer for, and you're going to want to test a stain or a paint you want. I would recommend going to the store and buying a couple to test. I got a different stain and a different paint to try. I ended up going with the dark espresso stain because I liked the way it was able to show the character and the quality of the wood with instead of paint, which just kind of covers it up. You are going to have to test the wood no matter what, because different woods take different stains and paints differently. So to make sure you're getting the desired look of the finished product you want, I would highly recommend trying a couple of different paints or stains. Now the next step is you have your wood, you have your moose antler. You have either two choices when it comes to cutting it down. This part is a little bit complicated, and I'm sorry if there is no like real answer here. Depending on the moose antler you buy and the size and the shape, the size of it is going to be different no matter what. You're gonna have to play around because every moose antler is different, and you're just gonna have to play around with the positioning as well as the size of the pieces of wood you want. You really have two choices though when it comes to this game of how big you want it versus how sturdy you want it. What Rick usually does is he cuts down the antler so it's flush to the leg of the stool as well as to the top of it. And what this does is it's gonna definitely make your stool smaller, but it's gonna make it more sturdier. What I ended up doing was I didn't want to cut the antler down as much because I think it's a really beautiful material and I want to make this piece as big as possible. So I kind of did a trade-off where I'm not cutting down the antler as much, but it's not as sturdy. I think the actual stools that Rick made, I've been told you can actually sit on them and they're that sturdy. Mine you can definitely not sit on. So when you're playing with the antler and trying to find a way to position it, if you want it to be more sturdy, cut it down to make sure it's flush to both pieces of wood, or if you just want it to be larger, keep that in mind that it's not going to be as sturdy, but you can make a bigger product because of that. So I was actually able to take mine from the regular 17 by 13 inches to make it 20 by 23. So it's almost 10 inches wider and about 3 inches taller. That makes it huge compared to an actual one. And also you can see a lot more of the antler and show off that kind of beauty, which I think is really cool. When you're going to cut down the wood and position the antler, you are going to have to play with it because every antler is different. But something you want to make sure of is that the antler is going to be flush against the ground so it has that sturdy support, and also that the antler from the ground is going to make a V shape. You're going to want a point of support towards the fulcrum where the top of the board meets the leg of the board, and you're also going to want a point of support, especially if you're making it bigger, towards where the table is not supported by the leg, in order so that the table does not collapse on itself or fall over. So what I actually did for the antler placement is I cut down the bottom and made that flush to the floor, as well as I put where the original base of the antler would be on the moose in that fulcrum area, and then I have one of the horn parts kind of going into the actual top of the table. Now to cut down the wood, it's going to be generally easy. You just want to make sure you cut down the top piece first, and then you're going to have to play a little bit around with cutting the leg piece to make sure it matches and is flush with the antler. But at the end of the day, you guys are just going to have to kind of play with it and kind of figure out how you want to position it in order to make sure that it is stable. When it comes to cutting the antler is actually not as brittle as it looks. I think I was really surprised when cutting this. It's actually super hard and sturdy, way more harder than wood. So don't be afraid to cut the antler or think that it's going to break. It's really, really, really hard. You're gonna need, this is why I say you're gonna need a skill saw or a table saw to cut this. There's really no other way. You can't use a hand saw. And when you cut this, just be aware, it's gonna smell absolutely terrible, like a burning fingernail pretty much. Get that kind of image in your mind. So once you've cut the antler down as well as the wood and kind of found a way to position it, what you're gonna wanna do then is you're gonna wanna drill 2 pilot holes down into the leg of the stool. That way there's a connection point there. And then you're gonna wanna drill 1 screw from the leg of the stool into the actual antler in order to have a connection point there. I think 1 screw should be fine. It's stable enough. The other option is you can use a poly to further connect it. And this is where my design differs a little bit from Rick. I use screws. If you actually take a look at an actual Stag stool, he seems to use some sort of poly or glue to connect the antler as well as the pieces of wood together. I just personally don't know how to use a poly like I do like I can use a screw, and I don't really mind as much the 2 screws on the top kind of breaking up the pattern. But if you want to be more true to form, use a poly. The one thing I also will say about using a poly is that it's not going to be as stable if you're trying to maximize it like I am. If you're going to cut down your Stag stool more and make it more flush to each part of the wood, using a poly would be a good idea. But if you're wanting to make it bigger like I did, I would definitely go for screws. The other reason I use screws is that way you can take it apart, it's easier to ship. When I made this back home in Minnesota, and then I shipped it out here to Seattle, so that way I take it apart and ship it easily. So that's one thing to be mindful of. The next step is once you've drilled the pilot hole and connected the antler into the stool as well as the top of the stool into the leg of the stool, once you get those pilot holes drilled and you get those screws in, I took them right out right after, and then what I did is I sanded the wood. Sanding your wood is going to be very important for this. If you've never done any woodworking before, sanding important, don't skip out on it. And then from there you can either paint or stain it. Again, the one thing I will say about using a paint versus a stain is that a paint is going to be much more matte. It's not going to bring out the nice, beautiful features of the wood like a stain will. However, if you are using a stain, be mindful of the type of wood you're using. I used a generally thicker wood that doesn't take stain as well, so I had to apply multiple coats of it. Also, I used a poly stain mix. If you're just using a paint or if you're just using a stain, make sure you put a poly on afterwards. That's going to protect the wood from anything you may put on it or from any chips. And from there, once you apply either multiple coats of paint or multiple coats of stain, you can go on to screw your Stag stool back together and it should be complete. And there you go. From there, once you screw it back together, you have your Stag stool. Obviously my model is a little bit different as I use screws, it's bigger, and I made more of a T instead of an L just for support. There's a lot of different ways for you guys to do this. No matter what, you're gonna have to play with it because each horn is going to be unique in itself. And I just thought I would make this video for you guys to show you that you can do it as well if I can, as long as you have access to the tools. And I hope this inspired you. Again, this has been Karsten Craning. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope it inspired you maybe to do something in a similar vein or just in general. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me and it helps support me and the channel and get my videos out there. And yeah, this has been Karsten Craning signing off.